to Israel?
No, she's only
Okay, Rambam, daily Rambam for Wednesday, Chaf Beis Menachem Av Tavshin Pei, which is Perek Chamishi, Perek 5 of Hilchos Talmud Torah. So in the first Perek and Perek Aleph through Daled, we learned about the first mitzvah of learning Torah, and now in the last Perek, Perek Hey through Zion, we're going to deal with the second mitzvah, which is L'chabed L'lamdeh V'yed'eh, to honor those who learn Torah. The actual mitzvah will be mentioned at the beginning of the next Perek, Perek Vav, which will discuss honor for a Talmud Chacham in general. This Perek is actually talking about the honor for your own Rebbe. So it's sort of a continuation of the previous Perek that dealt with interactions between the Rav and the Talmidim. So it's sort of like an in-between. It's continuing the topic of Rav and Talmud, but we're sort of moving on to the subject of honor and respect as opposed to the actual learning. So right now we're going to start with the idea that a teacher, a Rebbe, is greater, in fact, than a father. Aleph, so just as a person is commanded to respect his father and to fear his father, so similarly goes for his Rebbe. So seemingly it's more obvious to us, it's more simple. Also, we haven't mentioned yet that there's a mitzvah to honor Talmidei Chacham in general. So in general, we know that you're supposed to honor your father. And apparently maybe even in Lumdus, that unlike that mitzvah, which we're going to learn in the next paragraph about covered for a Talmud Chacham, which is sort of a separate thing. Talmud Chacham has nothing to do with you, but you're just respecting Torah in general. But here, the way you respect the reason why you respect your father is because of that connection that you have with him. So you can extrapolate from that based on what we understand about how important Torah is to a person, and based on what we learned about how important the Rav is who teaches you Torah. So just logically, the Rav is more essential in your life, at least as much or more than your father. So automatically, without even having to mention another mitzvah, you automatically know already that there's a special way of treating this Rav, similar to the way you treat one's father. Now the Rambam adds, Rabbi Yasser Miyav. So until now, he actually just said Kashem Kach, so it sounded like an equal. Now the Rambam adds, actually it's more. Your father just brought you into this world, but your Rabbi is bringing you to the next world, so that's greater. So how do we see, where do we see that the Rav is greater than the father? So here are some examples from Chazal. So if you see a lost object, you're supposed to return it in general, but if you see your father's and your Rabbi comes first. You have to leave your father's there if you can't take both. If they're both carrying something heavy, maniach here doesn't mean to ignore. Maniach here means to help your Rebbe put it down, and then you help your father put his down. Your father has to stand there and wait until you finish with your Rebbe. If they're both captured, first you redeem the Rav, then you redeem the father. And if his father is a Talmud Chacham, so now the halacha is going to change a little bit. Then the father comes first. So the rule doesn't always apply. It sounds like even if the father is not your actual Rebbe, but somehow the combination of your unique connection with your father plus the fact that he's a Talmud Chacham somehow outweighs the unique connection you have with your Rav. And then Rambam goes back to talk about the other cases. We only mentioned, we jumped in with the last case. What about the Aveda? So v'cheinem haya aviv chacham, afav b'shein shaku keneged rabbi, meishav avedasei, ve'achakach meishav avedas rabbi. So Rambam gets back to the first case as well, that if the father is a chacham, then even if he's not equal to his Rav, the father comes first and then the Rav. So went back to that previous case. Also added an additional detail that when we say the father is a chacham, not only he's not his Rebbe seemingly, but the father doesn't even have to be on the same level of scholarship as the father. And still, the father comes first. What's with the middle? Interestingly, he doesn't mention the middle case, but it should all be the same. What should the difference be? It's just interesting how the Rambam, the fact that it's starts working backwards. There's some interesting lashonos here, but that's what it is. The Rambam goes back to the general point about how even though we just ended up with the father, but back to the main point about how the Rav is greater. There's no greater respect than the respect you have for a teacher, and there's no greater fear than the fear you have for a teacher. And he concludes from Perek Yavos, the fear of your Rabbi should be like the fear of heaven. This is the ultimate.
A teacher in
No, so all the way towards the end of the Perek, and Muvalach Tas is going to say, this is all Rabbi Muvak, someone who really taught you everything you know. Yeah. Now, the fact that the Rambam added that detail that if the father is not equal to, even if the father is the Chacham, and not equal to the Rav, there's a whole tumult in the Mefarshim, because if you look in the Mishnah in Elam Metzius, which is where these dinim come from, the Mishnah seemingly says clearly, V'im ha'ya'aviv shakol k'neged Rabbi, if the father is equal to the Rav. And Rambam is saying here, if he wasn't shakol, you look in the Tesis Yom Tov there on the Mishnah, as he points out, there's actually two gersayos in the Mishnah. One gersa is V'im ha'ya'aviv shakol k'neged Rabbi, which is more, which is a higher standard, but there's another gersa of V'im ha'aviv chacham. He says clearly the Rav has his gersa. If you look in the Rav there's a gersa zunirli shahaysel Rambam k'shechiber Hilchos Talmud Torah. The Rambam must have been looking at this gersa when he wrote Hilchos Talmud Torah. Shekach kasa Perek v'im hayav Talmud Chacham etc. Av b'shein shakol. But other gersayos are from hayav shakol connected Rabbi. That wouldn't fit with what the Rambam. He says that was actually the gersa of the Rambam in Hilchos Aveda, because you look in Hilchos Aveda, the Rambam says something else. So it's one of those places where. So the Rambam, the opinion of the Rambam might be different in different places, and that's what the Perek. The Perek can go with that the father actually has to be shakol, has to be equal to the Rav, not just stam chacham. So that means the Rav is the father's taka very special. So now move on to the next topic by concluding halacha with the idea of the fear of the Rav. That brings us to our next point, which is about someone who is chelek al Rabbi. So your Rav. Yeah.
If he's a big Talmud Chacham, it's not your Rav.
That's not the subject there. Yeah. Therefore, Chachamim said, therefore, seemingly based on the last point we made, but you're starting up with your Rebbe, you're starting up with the Shechina, so that's going to be the point throughout the rest of this paragraph, that starting up with your Rebbe, you starting up with the Shechina. He brings it in 4 different ways, 4 Lashonos, 4 psukim from 4 stories of Moshe. So, Kol Chelek al Rabbi, number 1, Kechelek al Shechina. If you start up with your Rav, starting with the Shechina, Shnemar, Bat Seisam al Hashem. What's the story? That's the story in Parshas Pinchas. What's really the story from Korach, after the Magefa with Balak. So Hashem says count the Yidden, and they start counting Ruvain, and they get to Ruvain had a son Falu had a son Eliyav had his 2 sons Dasan and Aviram. The Moshe interrupts and says, it's Dasan and Aviram, those troublemakers. Asher Hitzu al Moshe. They started up with Moshe, and then they were swallowed, and it ends off. It says, Asher Hitzu al Moshe vel Aaron, that's Korach, but Seisam al Hashem. So the same pasuk says they started up with Moshe, they started up with Hashem, and then it says that they were swallowed, etc. So you see the pasuk is connecting, starting up with Moshe, starting up with Hashem. So that's Chelek al Rabbi, Chelek al Shechina. Number 2, v'chol ha'osim urivam Rabbi, someone who starts a feud with his Rabbi, ka'osim ha'shechina, is like doing that with the Shechina, Shnemar, Asher ravu b'nei Yisrael as Hashem. That's in Parshas Chukas. It says after Miriam passed away, they didn't have water, but Yorav Am Moshe, and they start complaining, and that's when Hashem says, take the stick and talk to the stone, and Moshe hits the stone, and then it ends off, it says, Hey, Mamei Meriva, Sheravu B'nei Yisrael Hashem. So it started off, it said, by Yorav Am Moshe, they fought with Moshe, and then it concludes and says, this is Mei Meriva, they fought with Hashem. So again, you see this idea that Moshe, Hashem. Number 3, v'chol Misraim al Rabbi, someone who complains, someone gets upset at his Rabbi, Misraim al Shechina, Shenamar, this is in Parshas B'Shalach, right after they left Mitzrayim, maybe the first time they complained, we should have died in Mitzrayim, we had food there, why are we going to die here in hunger? So over there it says clearly that we're going to have, it says you're going to have meat by night and you'll have man in the morning, and he says clearly that you're not complaining to us, you're essentially complaining to Hashem. So here you see this idea. The final one, someone who's second guessing, doubting his Rebbe, is like doing that to the Shechina. Shneimar vayidaber ha'am b'leikim v'Moshe. That's in Parshas Chukas. Later from the previous story that we mentioned, that after they started going around Edom to start going all the way around the whole Eretz Yisrael because they couldn't go straight, so they got very they got tired, and it says vayidaber ha'am b'leikim v'Moshe. There the passage just says clearly that they didn't complain about the God and Moshe together. That's when Hashem sent the Nechashim Asrafim, that whole story. So here you see the mamash together. Now there's 4 Lashonos here. Chelek, Meriva, Misraim, and Maharher. So I was looking, I saw they bring B'Shem Rav Kook that Chelek is Bahalacha. You argue with him in Halacha. Meriva is about Hagas HaTzibur, over Tzibur, over things relating to the public. Leadership. Misraim, he says, relates to intellectual subjects, intellectually. And he says that the word Al Hashem is mentioned both by Chelek and Misraim. He says that Al Hashem is more fitting for halachas and muskalas, And Mahar would be about the Midas and Tchunas, the Rebbe's traits. So that's how you can explain all four. From the Psukim, though, all four Psukim, you don't seem to see that this distinction between the different stories. Maybe by Perek, though, actually there is a little bit more of a connection to halacha, that the Perek Chazal say they were also attacking Moshe on halachic things. Okay. Moving on to halacha beis. So to explain what chilek Rabbi means, the Rambam is just going to use the term chilek, and indeed it's going to be about halacha. So ezu chilek Rabbi, what do we consider to be someone arguing, starting up with his Rabbi? Zesha kevei aloi medrash, v'yeshiv v'deirush malamed shaloi b'reshus Rabbi, v'Rabbi kayam afapi sh'Rabbi b'medina acheres. So that's someone who opens a medrash, meaning a base medrash, and he sits and he's teaching without his Rebbe's permission. His Rebbe is still alive, even if his Rebbe is somewhere totally different in a different country. So not, you would have thought maybe Chilek Rabbi means literally arguing with him on halachic discussions. No, what it means is that you're sort of undermining him when it comes to being an authority for the public, because we're assuming here that medrash means in the sense of teaching halacha. And this is going to be the topic now from halacha beis to halacha daled, the interaction. When does a Talmud, how can a Talmud teach? How can a Talmud paskin? So that's the next topic here. Now he says shaloi b'reshus, without his Rebbe's permission. So mashma that it's all okay if there is reshus. And what if you're not his Talmud? And what if you have your reshus from your Rebbe somewhere else? Might also not be a problem. However, I have a tshuva here from the Rambam. I don't think there's enough time really to look at it. There's a tshuva from the Rambam about a story where there was a dayan and a malamed came to town. The malamed didn't claim to be on the level of the dayan, but he started teaching Mishnah. And the question was, is he undermining the dayan? Is he not? And the malamed claimed he's just being a marbitz Torah. That's not the same thing. Marbitz Torah should be okay. And Rambam took a very strict position that he has to absolutely get reshus from the dayan, and even teaching Mishnah is problematic. And it sounds like over there it's talking about a more general authority, meaning here we're talking narrowly about your interaction with your Rebbe. Maybe your Rebbe himself isn't the greatest Rav in town, but even then you can't start up with your Rebbe. And another halacha that the Rambam seems to be talking about in the tshuva is, in general, a location has its own authority. You can't just come necessarily, if there's a dayan there, you can't just necessarily open up your own shop. But here we're speaking specifically about the Talmud and his Rav.
Was he elected? I mean,
I don't know if he gets into that, but it sounds like that was the
private shul. Private shul.
Right. Definitely a complex topic, and there's been many incidents over hundreds and hundreds of years. I'm just being aware that even though it sounds like it's all about your Rav, but it might be a little more complex. Like I said, there's a show that I'm about it. Ayin Sham. Right. Yeah. So this is all just Rav and Talmud. And this is apparently, we started off talking about Kavod and Meira, so this is all somehow included in that. So it's partially a matter of Kavod of your Rebbe. You can't just do whatever you want without asking him. But it also part of this also seems to be about, we can't just let anybody open up shop without permission. There has to be a hierarchy. So your Rav has to first approve you and give you, and if he didn't approve you, then maybe you shouldn't be doing the job. And if you still go ahead and do it without asking him, so you're going against your Rav, and then what's your whole basis of authority? Your Rav is your teacher. Now you're not behaving according to your teacher. Okay. And he said that the Rav has to be alive. So it's mashma that as soon as the Rav passes away, it's okay. But in Halacha Gimel, we're going to see that it's not just like we said, it's not just a covered thing. It's also we're trying to filter out people who aren't worthy. So if the Rav passes away, but the guy is still not worthy, that doesn't make it okay. So we're going to see later that there's a general barometer of worthiness, even if the Rav isn't around to say yes or no. Now we move on to generally paskening, even if without opening a whole base medrash, paskening in general. But also, you're never allowed to pasken in front of your Rav. And b'fnei Rav, I said this is going to be a little different. The rules here are not the same. It has to be in front of your Rav. Not in front of your Rav might be okay. As we're going to see in Halacha Gimel, and if you do, then you say Chayav Misa. That's Misa b'dei Shemayim. It's interesting to point out. There's an expression in Aramaic and in Hebrew, "Biasa b'kutcha." When something is very simple, very obvious, you say, "Oh, it's like biasa b'kutcha," which means an egg inside some kind of a dip. Where does that expression come from? So it's interesting to point out. It actually comes from this halacha. In the Gemara, the context was that the din of an egg in a dip is supposed to be the most obvious halacha in the world. So something as obvious as a biasa b'kutcha. What's the context? The context is that even something as simple as Biasa B'Kutcha, you shouldn't be paskening in front of your Rav, even something as simple as that. What is it? So according to Rashi, you would think that dipping plus the kutach had milk in it. It was dairy, so you would think that maybe dipping an egg in milk would be basar b'chalav. Egg comes from a chicken, and kutach is milk. So that's why even such a simple thing, such an obvious thing, obviously there's no basar b'chalav with eggs. Even that you wouldn't be allowed to say in front of your Rebbe. That would be an example of something that you're not allowed to say. Taisva say, that's too simple. That couldn't be the example. They make it more complicated. That it's the egg that was inside the chicken that wasn't laid yet, so maybe it's more of a meat-like product. Whole discussion. Just interesting to point out.
That's a complicated child.
Yeah, then that becomes a whole complicated. So why is he saying? Why is it even bias abakutcha? But yeah. Yeah.
The first way to make it in the simple sense, when a place was getting involved, it makes sense. But when place got involved, it's complicated China.
Right. I guess it was simple that the din, whatever the din was. However, it happens to be that you could make it a little more complicated. But anyway, there's different opinions in Gemara. I don't know. Okay, so now we're going to see that it's not always, when it comes to just Hayra, if you're not opening up your own base madrash, paskening isn't always so terrible, depending on the situation. So if they're 12 miles apart, the mill then might have been in slightly different measurement, but that's the idea, 12 measures apart. The shal loyadam dvar halach, and someone says, what's the halacha with such and such? Mutar lahashiv, then it's okay. And if you're trying to save someone from doing something wrong, then even in front of your Rav wouldn't be a problem. So what's the example? He sees someone doing something forbidden, either because the person doesn't know or the guy is taka wicked. He can stop him and say this is prohibited, even if his Rabbi is present, even without permission. And here comes the famous phrase, which comes from here: cover the Rav. Wherever there's a Chil Hashem involved, wherever God's name is being desecrated, then that overrides whatever honor you would think to give the Rav.
If you say the Rav is there, and you say the Rav said this is not permitted, I mean, you're saying
you could, but the story in the Gemara is
that's not considered speaking in front of your Rav.
You're saying if it's a regular shaila, not this.
Right. I mean, the Talmud says the Rav said this is this.
Did he say it?
It's
Did the Rav say it?
Yeah, he said it, but because in fact that's his Talmud. He knows.
I don't know, maybe not. Because we're going to see later that even after the Rav passes away, everything a person says is essentially the teachings of his Rav. So maybe that's what he's doing all the time, even on his own. So that in front of his Rav, that would still be in front of his Rav, would be a problem, I would think. The Rav can obviously give rishus. It's just a simple thing. The Rav shouldn't be, if the Rav doesn't have a problem with him answering people's questions and saving him some time, the Rav will just say it's okay. We're just talking about a case where the Rav didn't.
There's a comment about the mill. It's 2,000 cubits, which is approximately a kilometers, which is 2/3 of a mile.
Right, 2/3 of a mile. Yeah. The story in the Gemara, right? So the story of the Gemara, that's the source for this, is that Ravina was sitting in front of Rav Ashi, and he saw someone tying his donkey, to a palm tree on Shabbos, which you're not allowed to do. You're not allowed to tie things to trees. And so Ravina started screaming at him to stop, and then when the guy didn't listen, so then he put him in chayrim, he put him in nidui. So I think that's maybe the Rambam saying he didn't know, or because he's wicked, so that covers both. If he doesn't know, you're telling him, hey, what are you doing? And if he knows, then you put him in nidui. And he did both without asking Rav Ashi. And afterwards he asked Rav Ashi, by the way, was that okay? Was that a problem? And Rav Ashi said, no, this is the Kol Makom Sheshchil Hashem. That's where you jump without waiting, without asking. The Rambam goes back and clarifies the point about how we're distinguishing here between an incidental shayla versus opening a base medrash. It's really what we said before, but just to clarify, apparently, if it's only incidental to answer a question that just came your way, but to answer people's questions on a permanent basis, that's back to the previous halacha. Even if you're on opposite ends of the world, also there's no geographical, it doesn't help. You can't until your Rabbi gives you permission, or your Rabbi gives you permission. Either he passes away or he gives you permission. And now he clarifies, like I mentioned earlier, that even with the Rav's passing away, it doesn't automatically turn him into a Pesach. Just because the Rebbe passed away doesn't mean he could go ahead. He has to be a student who reached the status that he's able to teach, he's able to paskin. It's a concept. The Ram doesn't really explain the concept, but the idea here being that not everyone who studied means that he's ripe for paskening like that. And now that Rambam brings what Chazal say about someone who shouldn't be and is, or the opposite, someone who shouldn't be and is paskening anyway, so he's just a horrible all-around person. This is the pasuk of Mishlei. I don't think there's any special connection to the pasuk. I think the olav nemar just means that we're going to apply this pasuk to you, that you're causing a lot of casualties with your behavior. And the opposite, the chacham who should be paskening and isn't, he's depriving people of Torah. He's going to cause people to make mistakes. So he's also harming society. We're not talking about Malamakim, we're just talking about if the Rav passes away, there could be 10.
He didn't appoint anybody. The Rav passed away. He had great Talmidim.
Yeah, so they could all be, but only if they're Magiel Lahira, which we didn't define, but there's some kind of. Maybe smicha. Maybe that's it.
But who decides who's going to move into the Rav's place?
That's the different story we're not talking about. We're talking about if they could. The discussion is if they could give paskin.
Yeah. We're not.
So they have to have Haydah.
Like I said earlier with the Dayan, we're not talking about like local authority. We're talking about specifically the Rav and Talmud relationship. We're not getting into the who's in charge of the city. That's not the subject here, apparently. So all of Nemar Vatsum Kol Regah, at the end of the same pasuk, that also the casualties, the deaths that are being caused, so that goes for the other way, someone who's not paskening when he should. And now that goes on with another paragraph, where it just goes on about how the destruction caused by those who shouldn't be paskening and are these young Talmidim, these students who haven't really studied enough Torah properly, but they want to have a high status in front of the simple people, in front of the people of their city. And they jump to sit at the head, to pasken, to teach, to in front of on behalf of Yidden. They're proliferating machlekas, they're destroying the world. They're extinguishing the flame of Torah, and they're destroying the vineyard of Hashem. And Shlomo was describing them in his wisdom in Shir Hashirim. Also, I don't know if there's any special connection there in the context, but just using that terminology, these young foxes that are destroying. Yeah, describing them as a fox, which is not the same as a lion, and it's they're destroying the vineyards. So that's these people. Now, interestingly, the Gemara mentions something about the age of 40, but the Rambam doesn't mention anything about 40. So the Kasaf Mishnah explains that the Rambam's opinion is that the age of 40 must mean that someone already reached Torah before the age of 40. So now, between now and 40, he's allowed to delay himself. Not that you're not allowed to pass him before 40. You're allowed to if you're a Magiel Lahira, but you're allowed to. We wouldn't call you someone who's a Magiel Lahira Ve'enei Meira if you're being humble and you're waiting until 40. He says this is a Midas Chassidus. He says by the time that Rambam came along, no one's following this Midas Chassidus. So all we have to do is warn that those who shouldn't be paskening, they shouldn't be paskening. That we have to warn. But someone who's already worthy, he's surely going to jump right away. So there's no point in telling him you could wait. He's not going to wait. And in fact, he says it could be that because the Rambam goes on to say that there are people who shouldn't be jumping ahead, that are jumping ahead when they shouldn't be. So for sure, someone who is able to paskin, even if he isn't 40 yet, nowadays he might be mechayev to go ahead because it's an emergency, because look at all those other people. Okay, so age of 40 is out of the picture now. Now we move on to general practices of respect and fear in front of one's teacher, and he starts with the idea of not calling the Rabbi by his name, which actually got mentioned yesterday regarding the Meturgamon. So the Talmud can't call his Rabbi by his name, even not in front of him. And he shouldn't say his name in front of him, even not referring to him personally, just to say the word, that's his name. Or even to call someone else, that's what we mean. You're not calling the Rabbi Rabbi Yankel, you're referring to the other guy, Rabbi Yankel. which is the same halacha you have with your father. Apparently, we're supposed to know that you're not allowed to say your father's name in front of him, even if it's someone else.
He knows already. It was in the beginning, the first line.
Yeah. So
he knows already.
Yeah. Shana Shman v'afilu la'achar ma'asam. You have to change the name. Maybe say the name differently, and that's even after they passed away. So that's actually sort of a contradiction because he just said before in front of the Rebbe. You shouldn't say the name in a different kind of context in front of the Rebbe, and then he ends off, I feel even after they passed away. So there's the Bach. The Bach says that the Bach in Yeridea and the Simon on Kibbutz Aviv Rabbi. So he says that that's not apparently it's V'lo Yasker doesn't mean that it's Aser. V'lo Yasker means that it's an extra covet. So feel means.
In the beginning, he also says about the fun.
Right. So the Hachamar Haraman, the Bechai Rabbi B'fanav Yisuruhu the Iker Lasko Shmei B'fanav V'afil L'Kreis L'Achenim B'Shmam. So no. So V'liyask in the beginning is Aser. V'liyask Shmei B'fanav that is actually Aser. But then what he says at the end, it must mean not Aser, but you shouldn't do it. Yeah. But then adds what we're talking about here when we say that you shouldn't mention Rabbi Yankov Hushi Hashem Peli. The name has to be very distinctive for this halacha to apply. That you shouldn't be mentioning if his Rabbi's name is Avram and the word Avram comes up everywhere. You're not restricting you from saying the word Avram. It has to be a little more distinctive. Anyone who hears that name, you think, they immediately think of his Rabbi. So now the Rambam moves on to the concept of greeting, which seems to be a similar concept because when you call someone by their name, it shows a certain level of personal comfort with that person, ease, and so similarly it goes for how you greet them, how you interact with them. So you shouldn't say hello or return a hello the way friends do. You should bow his head, of a covet, and say with fear and respect, Shalom Alech Rabbi, peace upon you, my teacher. And if the Rabbi said hello first, he should respond, Shalom Alech Rabbi Umari, peace unto you, my teacher. And now we're going to move on to a list of things you know to do in front of your Rebbe, which are generally normal things to do, but in front of your Rebbe, it shows a certain kind of casualness. And that would be, I think all the things we're discussing here are more about fear. So it would show a lack of fear. Shouldn't take your tefillin off in front of him. In Sanhedrin, it says that this was what your Rambam did to Shlomo. Before your Rambam made trouble after Shlomo passed away, he already made trouble when Shlomo was alive. And Gemara says, he lifted an arm. What does it mean? It says that he took his tefillin off in front of him. So Rashi says either he should have turned away. It's just not respectful. You're just casually taking your stuff off. Rashi adds another reason that it could be also you're uncovering your head. We spoke once before that back then the head covering was just part of the general costume, general outfit. It wasn't necessarily stated as a separate chiyuv of kisei reish. It was just it's normal. And when you're taking off your tefillin, so you briefly uncover your head. So you didn't have a separate yarmulke, so you uncover your head covering and you're showing your head. That's disrespectful. So that's the story with Yeravam, that's the story here. But lo yasev, and you shouldn't lean in front of the Rebbe while eating, or b'chalal yeshuv b'nei hamelach. You should sit like you sit in front of a king. Of course, this is also famously this is the case for Pesach as well, by Heseba in front of your Rebbe. Lo yispal lefnei Rabbi, you shouldn't daven while standing in front of the Rebbe. Lo la'achar Rabbi, we're standing behind him. Lo b'tzad Rabbi, we're standing by the side. All of them seem like you're too casual with your Rebbe. If you can't daven on the side, certainly you can't walk next to him. Now later, I think in the next Perek, we're going to see there's a concept of walking next to a Talmud Chacham in a respectful way, but apparently here he means in a casual kind of way. You should go behind his Rebbe far, and you shouldn't be right behind him, just far into the side. And then you can daven, and you shouldn't enter with him into the bathhouse. Now we move on to sort of rules of etiquette, similar lahavdil to what you might have in the royal family. It's not just not to do inappropriate things, but even in sitting and standing and talking, there are subtle rules of etiquette. So layeshim came rabbi shouldn't sit in his Rebbe's place. So what does that mean? The Rambam actually was asked. Someone wrote a shayla to Rambam and said, "What do these words mean?" And And Rambam responded that it means that when your Rabbi says an opinion on something and you think the opposite, then it's the kind of thing where it can go either way. It's shackle. So you shouldn't say, I think I take the other position. That's the way Achriya Dvara B'fanav. And then the Yister is we shouldn't contradict him. So based on that, apparently the Yister means like actively trying to debunk what the Rebbe said. And the Achriya was just to say another position. You shouldn't sit until he says sit. And you shouldn't stand until he says stand. If you want to go already and Rav didn't on his own initiative tell you to go, you can ask. But you have to ask first. And if when you say goodbye, don't turn around, don't show him your back. So you have to just move backwards, and your face is still facing him. So that I believe is all seems like Meira, and now it seems like we're moving on to Kavod, things that are more about showing respect as opposed to disrespect, fear. So to stand when you see a Rebbe arriving, even when you see him far away, and you have to keep standing until you don't see him anymore. And then you can sit down. But and you also have to go see your Rebbe during Yom Tov. And this letter from the Rebbe, and we don't have much time, we have a letter from the Rebbe from Chavdal Tishrei Tavshin Ches, right after the Yom Tovim to Chassid. And the Rebbe said, I thought, like every year, you're going to come to me at Tzeres and Chas Torah, and we'll talk. And I see whatever reason stopped you, but it says, V'chaval, because Chazal say in Rosh Hashanah, Chayv Adam, Lahakul Pnei Rabbi B'Regel, and he says, see Kesef Mishnah Ram, Hilchos Talmud Perek Zayin. The Kesef Mishnah explains it. The Gemara seems to say that it's only if you're in the Tchum, you're within walking distance. But the Kesef Mishnah says the Ram doesn't mention anything about walking distance. So apparently the Ram holds that's one opinion, and the main opinion that we go with is that it doesn't matter. So obviously whoever the Rebbe is writing to is certainly not within walking distance. He was in another city. But the Rebbe has mentioned the Kesef Mishnah proved that it would still apply to anyone. And says nowadays, truthfully, we're makel. We don't take the etzem halach of lahakul pnei Rabbi B'Regel. We don't necessarily take it as Bible. You have to do it. There are reasons to be makel. There are certain reasons, but they goes on to give a whole explanation. Beruchnius, how Rabbi, the idea of l'shtachavois on Yom Tov says v'einon yuchel l'shtachavois. L'shtachavois is really bitul l'tzaynoi, to nullify your own will, and only someone like this can help you. And Shal Shagalim is the right time to go. That's the Rebbe explains how he missed out on lahakul pnei Rabbi B'Regel. Okay, now we have to really finish off. Ches in chokim kavod the Talmud pnei harav. You can't respect the Talmud in front of the Rabbi. Like a kavod, unless the Rabbi always gives the kavod himself. Whatever a servant does, the student should do. But so maybe it's an unfamiliar place where no one knows him and doesn't have tefillin. In those days, they wore tefillin all day. So if you're wearing tefillin all day, no one will think you're a servant, you're a slave if you're wearing tefillin. But if you don't have tefillin and you're afraid people are going to think you're actually a slave, then you don't do his shoes. You can stop there. And if the Rev says, don't serve me, that's not good. He's taking away a chesed that he could have done in Perek many years, Shemayim, and it's just going to affect the Talmud in a bad way. And if he's disrespectful at his Rebbe's honor, he's causing the Shekhinah to leave. What if his Rebbe's doing something wrong? He has to say in a respectful way. Didn't the Rebbe teach us such and such? And if he has to repeat something his Rebbe said, he says, this is what our Rebbe taught us. We see this in Mishnayos. And if he's saying something that he didn't hear from his Rav, then he should say who really said it, because the assumption is that whatever you're saying is from your Rav. When his Rebbe dies, there's kriya, but all his clothing till he shows his heart, and he doesn't ever mend the clothing. Now comes the big caveat. What's this all talking about Rabbi and Wuvuk? His actual Rabbi, the Mamash taught him, he taught him everything, or most things. If you just taught him some things, he's a Talmud Chaver, then his relationship is that of a Talmud but a Chaver, student but a friend. So none of these things apply. But the one thing, the few things you should do is you should stand up when you see him. And the Karei love, we should do Kriya, regular Kriya, like anyone you are mourning. Back then, it was more natural to do Kriya for anyone you felt bad for. Even if he learned one thing, you can still do Kriya and still stand up, or you should still stand up. Yod, this is from Perek Yavis. If you're Deis, this is from Hilchos Deis. You have your traits, you have your inner compass straight. Even if he's not your Rav, this is from the Shiva Dvarim B'Chacham and Perek Yavis. You don't speak in front of someone who's greater than you, so it belongs here because it's sort of, you're treating him like a Rav even though he's not your Rav. Yud Aleph, Rav Muvak, Shirat Lim Chalak Kved Mikol Adon Ma'ilu Be'achad Man, Lachol Tamidu Be'achad Man. It should be understood. Rav can be moichel on his covet for any of these things. He has the permission. A king cannot. A Rav could. Alf B'Shemach Chayv Talmud Lahadav Afilu B'Shal Shemach. But the Talmud should still try to do it just because the Rav said it's okay. It's okay. Yud Beis. The Karman goes the other way also. You have to treat the Talmidim with respect. You should treat your Talmidim like your friends. You should be careful and to love them because they're like the children, your true children, both in this one and the next. Talmidim truly actually give the Rav something. The Rav gets smarter from them. I learned the most from my own Talmidim. Like a small fire, a small wood lighting the big one, like a match lighting a big piece of wood, the Talmud can make the Rav sharper. With his questions, greater wisdom that we would ever have before comes out from the questions.